Okay, before we get started, I got a couple of announcements. First, if you want to get some extra credit, find a transcendentalist quote and tell me why you like it. Does not have to be in depth. You know, a few sentences, no more than half a page. But give me the quote, who it's from. Just make sure it's a transcendentalist. Well, next Wednesday can be the deadline. So you'll have to print it off, and I want it typed out. And y'all can turn it in Wednesday. It'll be 5 points of extra credit. My other announcement is I'm not going to be here on Monday. I have a doctor's appointment in San Antonio that I can't reschedule. So we're just not going to have class. So instead of class, you're going to have an assignment. This one's not optional. It's going to count for a grade. I haven't kind of worked out the details in my mind, but I haven't got it on paper yet. I will definitely have it by Friday. It's going to involve finding a flag from a pre-Civil War, I knew we had flags. I knew flags were a big thing, but it was pointed out to me by somebody that an event had a flag that I really wasn't aware of. And then I got to looking into it. They had flags for everything. Pretty much any little revolution, any rebellion. Of course, there's always a state flag. You can't use the Gadsden flag. That's the Don't Tread on Me one. If you really, really like the Don't Tread on Me flag, there are some other versions of it, but you're going to have to hunt them down. You just can't use the Gadsden one, which is the one everybody sees. And you can't use the join or die, you know, the snake cut into pieces. But what I want you to do is find a flag and then explain to me the symbolism that's on the flag. So like if you choose a state flag and it has a tree on it, I want you to tell me, why does it have a tree on it? What kind of tree is it? And why is that tree important? And pretty much anything from the Revolutionary period up to 1850. So no Civil War flags. Those are too easy. That's going to be the gist of the assignment. Like I said, I've worked it out in my head. I just haven't figured out how to get that all on paper yet, but I will have that by Friday. But you can use Monday's class to work on that. I don't think I'm muted like that. Oh, that wasn't mine. That was somebody else's. But that's okay. Just turn my volume down in case I didn't mute it. I did. Now it's found this really great case for my phone, but it makes it hard to turn the on and off. It's perfectly waterproof. I've actually taken it scuba diving. You know, so haven't gone to great depths, but like 45 feet, and it doesn't leak. It's really a neat phone case. It was only like 15 bucks. But the only drawback is it's hard to turn the volume on and off. So I don't always remember to do it. Okay, so we were talking about the Transcendentalist. And those of you who are late, if you want to know the announcements, you can stay after class and ask me what they were. I'm not going to repeat them right this second. But where we stopped was at the poets. So we named the poets. The other big literary movement, which kind of a stretch to say this is a literary movement, but it is. It does deal with literacy and illiteracy, were newspapers. The United States was a very literate nation. The predominance, like almost up to, well, 91% of the white population could read and write. 78% of the entire population could read and write. That's pretty good odds. And part of this were newspapers. The steam-driven press, and the United States is always, even in the colonial period, we had an unusually large number of newspapers. And this just keeps growing. The steam-driven press, which was introduced into England in 1825, made newspapers even easier to print. You could print 4,000 sheets an hour. And American inventor Richard Hoe from New York invented what was called the rotary press. That's the ones you sometimes see on old movies where they're cranking it and it's just spitting newspapers out. And it really did spit them out. 20,000 sheets an hour. So 5 times improved. And newspapers get to be very inexpensive. This is when the penny newspapers come about. And you have the little newsboys standing on the corner hawking newspapers for a penny, which was pretty good. I mean, it was cheap enough, people could buy it. The newsboys, at least initially, made pretty good money because they would buy their newspapers for a nickel, sell them for a dime, or sell them, no, that's later. That's when they become a dime. Penny ones, you buy them for half a cent and you sell them for a penny. So, when you buy them, you buy 2 for a penny. You sell them, you make 2 cents. So you've doubled your money. And there's more newspapers in the United States than anywhere in the world. Now, the South is going to lag behind the North. The North is probably going to have twice as many newspapers as the South. I don't have the exact numbers. But that doesn't mean the South didn't have newspapers. They just didn't have as many. Education in the South took a slightly different bent than it does in the North. And education is going to be our next topic. Like I said, in 1840, 78% of the population could read and write. 91% of the white population. We don't have public education yet. So most people were taught in church, in private dame schools, with formal tutors, or simply by their families. Most people learned to read the Bible. That was usually what you learned how to read. So if anybody has tried reading the King James Version of the Bible, it's not the easiest thing to get through. Imagine that's what you're learning how to read with. But they learn. But there's still not a school system in the modern sense. Some of the schools have, like Massachusetts has had it in their charter ever since they were a colony, that towns of a certain size had to have a school. But most of those laws had been abated. The demand for public schools peaks around the 1830s. And there are a lot of people demanding it. One group were the immigrants. They want public school because they see education as a way up. That's how their children are going to, achieve the American dream, is through education. Middle class America wants education to, again, advance their children, but also because middle class gets really involved in reform. And education is seen as a way to improve society. It's going to improve manners. it's going to reduce crime, and it's going to reduce poverty. Because if you educate people, then they can find jobs. If you take these kids off the street, they're not just out there doing mischief. It's, these little cretins that don't have good parents that teach them right from wrong, they'll learn that in school now. That doesn't address the fact that the little cretins that don't learn right from wrong for their parents, it's because their parents are both working 16 hours a day and they're never around. That's a whole nother issue, but the reformers are going to tackle that too. Horace Mann of Massachusetts led the drive in his state, set up a state board of education and a state school system that's going to become kind of a model for the rest of the country. And other states take notice. In the South, North Carolina was a leader in child education. By 1860, it's enrolling more than 2/3 of the white school-age children for at least 4 months. Now, that doesn't seem like a very long school year, but those 4 months are when the farms are fallow and you can afford to send your kids to school because you don't need them home to work the farms. That's kind of why we have summer vacation. Summer vacation is when the kids could be sent off, No, summer's when we need them at home. You had school in the winter. You'd think I could remember what the school year was because I teach. But that's where summer vacation originates, is because the farm kids just simply wouldn't go to school. The parents couldn't afford to send them. So, well, if you don't have kids in school, you don't need to have teachers, save the money. So people who are advocating now for year-round school, that's one of the things they point at is we don't need that anymore. But I still think people need a break. Now, one area that the South did lead in is they have a higher percentage of college students. And that's because the wealthy planters and the better-to-do middle class who wanted to emulate the wealthy planters would send their students, their young adult children, off to school. They didn't focus so much on a public education system, but privately, the people with money made sure their children were educated. To the point usually that they would send them abroad, either to London or Paris to go to school. But the South still has the highest illiteracy in whites in the country. And even though there is improvement, it's still a long way from being a true, solid education system in the United States. But they're getting there. Higher education. There were 78 colleges and universities in the United States in 1840. Almost all were religious-based. There's a few secular schools, but most were religious-based. The state, usually in the South, had universities where there was no colonial university, where those religious universities had not been established. In the West, you have federal policy helping to establish colleges. When they set aside money from townships, there were two, for each territory, 2 townships were set aside, the money from those to support higher education. Now, there was no set curriculum. There was a lot of differences between schools. Each school pretty much kind of decided what they were going to teach. And there was a lot of competition for funds, particularly between the religious schools and the state schools. Not so much private secular schools. They were usually pretty set. And most schools, particularly the religious ones, focused on a certain aspect of curriculum. A lot of them were, in a sense, theology schools. You know, they were originally designed to churn out ministers in response either to the First Great Awakening or the Second Great Awakening, depending on when they were established. But you're starting to see a more modern college system develop. The University of Virginia, which was Jefferson's school, the school he sets up, combine pure knowledge with practical knowledge. And this is going to influence particularly the South and the West, kind of lends itself to the A&M schools, agricultural and mechanics, where, yes, you're learning the pure knowledge. You're getting Latin, you're getting Greek, you're getting philosophy. But, you know, philosophy, while it is very interesting and can help you understand people, doesn't help you build buildings or fix roads or, you know, doctor somebody. It's not, I'm not, a philosophy teacher would probably kill me. It's not a very useful, at least practical science. And Jefferson stressed that you need to have useful knowledge as well. Now, the engineers, that kind of took off. The U.S. Military Academy at West Point is established in 1802, and the Naval Academy at Annapolis is established in 1845, and they start churning out engineers. That's where most of the engineers will come from in this 1800 to 1850 period. You do get some out of other schools, but if you could say, you know, you were trained at West Point, you get a job as an engineer, pretty much, if you graduated high enough. West Point had there's a tiered system, at least in the 1800s. So if you went to West Point and you graduated first in your class, you were expected to be an engineer, but you really had your choice. You could pick any branch of the service. But the way it normally worked, top tier of graduates were engineers. Then you went into artillery. Then you went into infantry. And the last group in the class became cavalry officers. And the last person graduating at West Point was a goat. And not in the sense that y'all know the word goat, but that's what they were called. They were called the goat. Custer was a goat, which kind of proves that he was last in his class. He didn't remember some of his training. But anyway, that's where you get engineers. The other part of that is a digression. A lot of technology was still learned through practice. You still had the apprentice system for a lot of trades, even professional trades. But higher education is starting to make inroads into that, where people are starting to be trained to be professionals in an academic setting. Now, this is still a male world. In most higher education, most schools, like all but one, only took men, and they only took white men. There were a few female seminaries like Willard, which will grow into a college. Rather than teaching pure science and useful knowledge, They stress social amenities and music and art so that you can be a well-rounded housewife, useful in society, but not making any money. Vassar is the first women's college to stress academics. And in the West, Oberlin College, which we talked about a little bit already when we talked about Finney, because he becomes president, will accept women. But women were still in a subordinate status. They were expected to do all the cleaning. They were not allowed to speak out in class. They were not allowed to speak at, recite anything at graduations, but they could go to school. And this education is only one of these reform movements. The antebellum period, which antebellum just means pre-war, and the war we talk about in this part is the Civil War. In this antebellum region or time, you have a lot of reform movements. Reform movements come out of a lot of different, there's a lot of different factors that are feeding into this. One, you have Romanticism, which stresses the good of humanity. It stresses individuality. And it stresses that good humans will do good things. And it is your duty to improve your society. You get the Second Great Awakening. It's kind of the same stresses, just a different angle on it. You're also seeing a middle class growing. And that's important because when you have a middle class, you have people who have a little bit of time on their hands. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. And that was an adage they lived by. So if you were a wife and your husband was a professional or a semi-professional, and he made enough money that you didn't have to work, you were obligated to be part of this reform movement. You were obligated to help either in your church, in your community. Most wives didn't just sit home. But this is when people are being able to afford housekeepers. Well, if you have a housekeeper, then you have less to do. And you have time. So you have a group of volunteers. And this women's group of volunteers is going to last up into about the 1970s. Maybe probably even into the 80s and maybe even some into the 90s. But now most women also work. And if you work in a nonprofit like I do, poof, your volunteer force is gone. 20 years ago, most junior leaguers didn't work. And junior leaguers were volunteers. Now almost everybody works. Again, I digress. But these are the factors that are coming together. You have big movements that are stressing human goodness and that we're sort of responsible for making the world a better place. You have people with time on their hands, this growing middle class that aren't having to spend every waking hour of their day trying to make enough money to pay the rent and pay the bills. And you have a lot of things that are going wrong. They found all kinds of things to get involved in. Observation of the Sabbath, because there were people who had to work 7 days a week. So there's a movement to make the Sabbath holy and keep people from working on it. Dueling. Dueling should be outlawed, right? Crime. Punishment for crime. Does it fit the crime? Are we punishing people wrong? Penitentiaries become one of the targets because the jailing, the prison system was, if you can get the door shut, they're not overcrowded. And you may be a murderer and you just may be a debtor, but we can shove you both in the same cell. That doesn't matter. We'll throw you in there with, a robber and a deviant and this crazy person that we just don't want on the street anymore. There was no separating people out. And there was a lot of violence in prisons. Hours and condition of work, poverty, vice, pacifism, care of the disabled, foreign missionary work, temperance, women's rights, slavery. Everything was fair game for the reformers. And there were a lot of things that did need to be reformed. Sanitation. Kind of an ugly thing to have to think about, but it's an ugly thing that you want to think about because you're walking through it every day. There were a lot of things that drew a lot of people's attention. Now, temperance was one of the biggest. It's probably the most widespread campaign, followed very closely by abolition, which is going to overtake it. And temperance people were very unyielding. We'll put it that way. I mean, the bad effects of alcohol on the body had been known for quite a while. You drink too much, you rot your liver, you can't really function. Alcoholism is bad for you physically. That was known. Temperance workers pointed out that drinking and working didn't always go together. If you watch the Erie Canal video where the guy takes a slug of whiskey before he goes back to relight the fuse, I probably would have had to too, even though I can't do whiskey. It burns. But drinking on the job was commonplace. But now you're drinking on the job around machinery. You're drinking on a job around open vats of molten steel. It may work more dangerous. So this was an area that they blamed. They point out a relationship between drinking and poverty, which was kind of a stretch. If you actually look at the numbers, which they didn't do, but we do. We're big on, today's society is big on statistics. There really wasn't. The poor didn't drink as much of their paycheck as the temperance leaders would make you believe. But they form a few associations. In 1826, the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance is formed in Boston. They lead lectures, they have press campaigns, they host essay contests, local societies. They're the ones that come up with the word teetotalers. Because, the soldiers of the cross, which is what they called themselves, should lead blameless lives. So you would have to sign that you were totally abstinent. That's where, you put a T for total. You were a teetotaler. In 1833, the American Temperance Union is formed in Philadelphia. And by 1836, both groups are calling for complete abstinence. They actually print, if you can find a lot of the Bibles that are printed during this time period, will have a page, in the big family Bibles. In the middle of it, there's usually a section for marriages, births, deaths. Well, if you can find one that's printed in this 18 to 1850 period, a lot of times there was also a page for temperance where the family members could sign that they were teetotalers. Now, the problem with complete abstinence, it's a problem that any group goes into. You just can't make people quit everything. It's just too extreme. And, in 1836, a lot of their more moderate members decided that signing that tea was just a little more than they bargained for. And they, rather than, sign up for total abstinence, they just decided to be absent from the whole process. But it's going to be a continued reform movement, and it's going, we're going to press on through until they finally, in the early 1900s, get that amendment that they want, and we have prohibition. That doesn't last long, because like I said, anytime you go too extreme, you lose your moderate members. And it doesn't matter what the issue is. Prisons and asylums were another issue. Kind of mentioned that. This was based on this romantic and religious idea of the basic goodness of humans, that, okay, he might be a serial killer, but deep down he's good. And if you can just remove him from that situation that makes him a bad person, he can be reformed. Well, okay, so I'm using a very extreme. Serial killers can't normally be reformed. But the idea is, rather than just punishing the prisoners, we need to fix them. Remove them from society and let the needy and the deviant get the help they need, and then they can be returned to society as productive citizens. And that's okay for a while. But penitentiary or jails, prisons become a breeding ground for brutality and neglect, even after they start kind of sorting out people based on what they did. The penitentiary system, which is a little bit different, starts at this time in Auburn, New York in 1816. And if you follow the news right now, New York has some major prison issues. I think they've shut down 6 prisons in New York already this year because of violence. But the Auburn system basically held everybody in solitary confinement. So you could think about your crime and get over it. And by 1840, there were 12 more like it. It was not successful in the sense that it really fixed people, but it did cut down on a lot of the brutality because people were kept separate. They were brought together for meals, but you just marched in, set them down, let them eat, and then took them all back to their spots. At the same time, they start removing the debtors and the insane from prisons. The insane were a real issue. The first insane asylum was really the Pennsylvania Hospital in 1751, but most people just kept their insane relatives home. The joke is, in the South, we keep them in the parlor, in the North, they keep them in the attic. But they did bring them home, or they ended up in prisons, or they ended up in almshouses or homeless. By 1815, asylums are started that begin separating the disturbed from the criminal. And a lot of this comes from the actions of a lady named Dorothea Dix. Now, they start separating them early. Dorothea Dix in 1841, as I said, 1815 is when they first start. In 1841, she's asked to teach a Sunday school class at a Cambridge House of Correction. And she comes upon a room of, and this is in March in Massachusetts, where it's cold. And she comes upon a room of maybe a dozen nearly naked, mentally challenged people who are basically just sitting there huddling in the cold and freezing to death, totally neglected. She does a lot of investigation, makes some reports to the Massachusetts legislation, and goes a long way to getting these issues changed. And kind of brings about more of the modern idea of an insane asylum, where they actually take care of the patients, at least meet their basic human needs. Women's rights. Women are involved in almost all of the reform movements. But women don't have a lot of rights of their own. And, you know, it's not really, it doesn't take that big of a brain to figure out, hey, we're trying to fix this, and this, but we can't vote. We can't own property. You know, maybe we need to fix that too. Catherine Beecher becomes a leader in the education movement and the founder of a women's school in Connecticut and Ohio. And she publishes a book called The Treatise on Domestic Economy. And this is the basis for this idea of the cult of domesticity. Now, Catherine Beecher was not a women's reformer. I have her under here because everybody else is going to revolt against what she's saying. Her book lays out basically the status quo of women. And she phrases it in such a way that it sounds like it is an honor. And it is, in a sense, to be a wife and a mother. And that women should exert their energies on influencing that sphere of their life. And she says in her book that women have more power as influencers over their husband and children, and that is where they can make a difference. Not going out and telling the world, hey, I am a human, I should be able to vote. She points out this moral role in civilizing her husband and family, and that is where women's power should lie. And there is some truth in that. And you like, all right, how many of you guys have ever been on like a football team and you've had a woman's coach walk into the dressing room? Everybody starts acting a little bit nicer, right? You start watching what you say. My experience with this is firemen. Firemen are like overgrown little boys, but when one of the wives or a girlfriend or a daughter walks in, all of a sudden they start watching what they say. Did the coach say, hey guys, I'm coming in, you've got to be nice? No, it's just a natural reaction. There's a woman there, you're more polite. So there is sort of something to her argument. The Army will make this argument in the late 1800s when they decide to get rid of laundresses. Because on a lot of military posts in the Western frontier, the laundresses were the only women. And they were, as these officers argued, a civilizing factor. You see this in the colonial period, when the first groups that come over are men, and when the women start coming over, that's when things start getting a little more civil. So there is something to her argument, but it's not the end of the argument. And by the 1840s, women were starting to protest their status. And a lot of it comes out of the anti-slavery movement. In 1848, Lucretia Moat, who was a Philadelphia Quaker, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized a convention at Seneca Falls to discuss the, quote, social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. And they take the Declaration of Independence and use Jefferson's words to kind of fight their own battle, to declare their own independence. And they put out a declaration of sentiments, and in it they write, quote, all men and women are created equal. And then they argue that laws subjecting women, quote, in a position inferior to that of men are contrary to the great precept of nature and therefore of no force or authority, unquote. So they use the words of the Declaration of Independence to declare their independence. Even though there were a lot of women there, like I want to say close to, I didn't write the number down. Let me see if I can find it real quick. There were several hundred. I don't think there were close to 1,000. Yeah, there were almost 1,000 delegates. Only a third had the courage to sign the document. But that's still over 300 women. In the 50s, Susan B. Anthony is going to join those two women. She was unmarried. She had time to devote to it. Both Stanton and Moat were married, and even though they had supportive husbands, they didn't have the time. A lot of people said that Stanton, how did they phrase it? Stanton fashioned the thunderbolts and Susan B. Anthony hurled them. So they worked together, and they do make some progress. By 1839, Mississippi gives married women control over their own property. So if you're coming into a marriage and you have property that you have inherited or that you have bought, possibly, you have control over that. It doesn't go to your husband just by the fact that you say, I do. And by the late 1860s, 11 more states had followed suit. So they're starting to make some gains. You know what? We are going to speed through this last part, and we're going to get done with Romanticism and religion. Because this last part is really, it's very interesting to me, but it's not all that important. Utopian communities. That is another, I won't say it's an American phenomenon because it does happen in other parts of the world, but Americans kind of make their own twist on this. And utopian communities surge in the 1800s. And there's like 2 or 3 different, you'll get a big burst, like around the 1820s, 1830s, you're going to get another one around the 1870s and 80s. And so a utopian community, and then you're going to get them back they're going to come back again in the 1960s and 70s when we have the hippie movement. A utopian community is a perfect community. They're trying to create utopia, which is a perfect society. And there's more than 100 different utopian communities that will be established between 1800 and 1900. The Shakers are the longest lasting. They are still lasting. They have changed some of their rules because originally Shakers were celibate, which means your community will die out. And It was founded by a woman named Ann Lee, and they viewed God as both a man and a woman. Christ is the masculine version, Mother Ann is the feminine. They had religious, religious fervor was a sign of inspiration from the Holy Ghost. So this is a religious community. Shakers was their, I didn't write down their actual name. Shakers is kind of like Quakers. That's the name that other people have given them because they would have fits, visions, prophecies. They would shake. But they also become the leading source of garden seed in the United States, medicinal herbs, and as well as clothing and furniture, which they still sell. You can still buy Shaker clothing, Shaker furniture. It's very, they live a very simple life. They don't use power tools. They don't use electricity, things of that nature. The Oneida community was another one. It was not a religious community. It was, well, it was. He said that true conversion, the man that founded it is John Humphrey Knowles, and he preached that true conversion came with perfection and a release from sin. So he gathers all these perfectionists near his home in Putney, Vermont, and they're going to live in their perfectionism in this community, and they're doing okay. Oneida is where you get silverware. They were silversmiths. He had about 200 people by 1850, but they practiced something called complex marriage, where everyone in the community was married to everyone else. So monogamy was not practiced because you could be with anybody that you were married to, and you're married to everyone. He gets arrested for this, but the community lives on. It doesn't live on very long. Most of these utopian communities will die off pretty quickly because one of the problems with utopian communities is everybody's vision of perfection is slightly different. And then you start having personality clashes and things fall apart. New Harmony is another one. It was formed by Robert Owen, who feared the degrading effects of a factory system. He started this in a town called Harmony, Indiana, which he renamed New Harmony, that we're going to live on a farm system. It's going to dissolve by 1828. One of the most successful was Brook Farm. It was a transcendentalist community. It was led by George Ripley, who was a Unitarian minister. You know, they were all going to live out there, free thinking, living deliberately. Their biggest contribution was it had a community school that they allowed outsiders to come into, which kept them afloat because they paid tuition. But you had all these free-thinking individualists that didn't free think the same way. And there's fire that burns the school down, and that pretty much burned up the spirit of the whole idea. And it ended, when did it end? The building burned in 1846, and that was pretty much the end. But you had lots of these little communities that would spring up. And like the Shakers, you know, they had seeds and furniture and medicinal herbs. Some had wine and cheese. They all had, you know, the Oneidas had silverware. They all had something that they offered. But this idea that we could create a perfect society is part of the American character. And it fits into that Romanicist idea, and it fits into that Second Great Awakening idea that we can create perfection on earth. And these utopian communities are actually attempts at doing that. Okay, that is the end of romance and religion. We will start something else on Friday, but I will open the test sometime today. And y'all will I'll leave it open through Sunday. And you got yesterday's done?
I did.
Okay, cool.
What were they now?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay, so Monday, we're not gonna have class. I will post an assignment. And if you want extra credit, if you will find me a transcendentalist quote, type it out on paper and tell me why it moves you, how it speaks to you. You know, just a few lines. I don't want a whole lot, no more than half a page. Give it to me by next Wednesday.
Okay.
Okay?
Thanks.
Do you have another sign-up sheet for volunteering for Fort Country? Because I hit a deer Friday. I hit a deer on 277 Friday night.
Yeah.
And the whole front of it, that wasn't the worst part. I was on 277, you know, it's 2 lanes, different
Right.
traffic, and a car, a little Mitsubishi Eclipse. I was trying to cut the airbags, I had to get to my kids, and a car hit it and threw it into my car at 75 miles an hour.
Ooh.
I was like, it was like a deer right on my face.
Hmm.
Did anyone turn in AirPods?
No.
Okay, I was just checking. I lost
Yeah.
them and I have no idea where they.
Go check in the history office,
Okay.
because that's where they would have, if they didn't give them to me, but that would be another place they would have turned them in.
Yeah, someone left their phone like last week, and that's where it was. Usually,